Welcome to another deep dive. One of the biggest puzzles in thinking about thinking is this question of where does our understanding of the world even come from?
Yeah, it's a really basic question, but it has huge implications.
Totally. So, are we born already knowing stuff? Is there some knowledge just kind of built in, hardwired?
Right. That's the nativist view, right?
Yeah.
The idea of, I guess some people call it innateness.
Innateness, yeah, I've heard that too. Versus, I guess, the other big idea, what is it? Empiricism.
Yeah, empiricism.
Yeah.
That we're basically blank slates at birth, and everything we know, we learn through experience.
Right, right. So it's nature versus nurture all over again, but applied to everything we know.
Yeah, and it gets really tricky fast because even defining what innate even means is a whole philosophical rabbit hole.
Oh, yeah, for sure. Bruce and Ray, they really go into that.
Exactly. It's not as simple as just saying, oh, you're born with it.
Right. And then, there's all this historical baggage, too. When people hear nativism, they immediately think of those old rationalist philosophers.
Yeah, like Descartes with his innate ideas about God and stuff.
Exactly. And while those guys were definitely big on innateness, contemporary nativism is kind of its own thing.
Right. So we might see nativism and rationalism used interchangeably, especially when talking about those historical figures.
Right, but when we're talking about the science of how the mind works, it's a distinction worth keeping in mind.
Yeah, fully. And for a good chunk of the 20th century, empiricism was really the dominant view, especially with behaviorism.
Yeah, the behaviorists, forget about innate ideas. They didn't even want to talk about the mind.
Right, that whole anti-mentalism thing. They just focused on observable behavior and how it's shaped by experience.
The idea was that you can explain everything we know and do through learning, through conditioning, through associating stimuli and responses.
Yeah, and for them, claiming that something was innate was basically, unscientific.
Right, you're giving up before you even start trying to explain it.
But then, boom, along comes Chomsky in the 50s and 60s, and suddenly nativism is back on the table.
Yeah, Chomsky and his revolution in linguistics, that's really where this whole modern nativism thing takes off.
Exactly. And that's what we're going to dig into today. How did this revival happen?
Yeah.
What's the evidence for it? And what does it all mean for how we understand ourselves?
Okay, so let's talk Chomsky. Now, one of his big targets was behaviorism, right?
Yeah, he absolutely went after Skinner and that whole approach.
But even Skinner, as Pinker points out, wasn't completely anti-innateness.
Right. Skinner talked about respondents and operants. Respondents are these, they're almost like reflexes.
Okay, so like a baby sucking when something touches its lips.
Exactly. And then operants are more like these spontaneous actions, like a baby babbling.
Okay. So even for Skinner, there had to be something innate to work with. You can't condition a rock.
Exactly. And it's interesting because, while behaviorism was all about learning through association, they also had this real aversion to mental states.
Yeah, that whole anti-mentalism thing again. The mind was this black box you weren't supposed to look inside.
Right. But then, at the same time, they had to admit that these basic behaviors, these respondents and operants were, they had to be coming from somewhere.
It seems kind of contradictory, doesn't it? They wanted to ignore the mind, but then they needed these innate behaviors, which, they're obviously produced by the brain.
Yeah, it highlights how ideology can sometimes, distort the way we approach scientific questions. The idea of a blank slate was so entrenched that even when the theory required some innate elements, they kind of downplayed it.
Right, and that's where Chomsky really comes in and throws a wrench in the works.
Exactly. And his critique wasn't just about anti-mentalism. He also pointed out that, look, the complexity of what we learn, especially language, it just can't be explained by simple association.
Yeah, language is it's way too intricate.
Right. And Chomsky, he emphasized two things about human languages. One, their structure, their grammar, it's incredibly complex.
Yeah. And two, kids pick it up so easily, so effortlessly.
Exactly. They're not explicitly taught the rules, they just kind of absorb them.
Right. And to understand how this could even be possible, Chomsky introduced this idea of a generative grammar.
Right. It's essentially a set of rules that can generate all and only the grammatically correct sentences of a language.
And it also tells you how to pronounce them, what they mean, the whole 9 yards.
Exactly. And Chomsky linguistics became this this whole project of trying to figure out what these underlying rule systems actually look like.
Okay, so how does this tie into the nativism debate?
Well, Chomsky argued that if we're going to take grammar seriously, then we have to admit that speakers have mental representations of these rules in their minds.
He basically psychologized grammar, right?
Right. Like the rules aren't just some abstract thing out there, they're actually in our heads.
Mhm.
And that immediately raises the question, how do they get there?
Right, because for an empiricist, learning grammar would be like learning any other fact.
Yeah, just through exposure and association. But Chomsky argued that, look, the sheer complexity of grammar compared to the limited and often messy language kids hear, it just doesn't add up.
It's like kids are figuring out this incredibly intricate system from a bunch of random conversations. It seems impossible.
Exactly. And that leads to the famous poverty of the stimulus argument.
Yeah, the idea that there just isn't enough information in the environment for kids to learn grammar solely through experience.
And Chomsky argued that this missing information has to come from somewhere, and his answer was universal grammar.
Or I've also heard him call it linguistic theory.
Right. It's basically this innate language-specific endowment that guides language acquisition. It's not just a vague idea of being born with language. It's a specific claim about pre-existing structure in the mind.
Okay, so this was a pretty radical idea, right?
Oh, absolutely. And it was controversial. Philosophers, linguists, psychologists, they all had their issues with it.
Yeah, I mean, just the idea of mental representation itself was, well, it was pretty new at the time.
Right. And then there were debates about the nature of grammar, how formal it should be, how it relates to actual language use.
But despite all the controversy, Chomsky's work had a massive impact. I mean, it basically reshaped the field of linguistics.
Totally. And it led to the creation of developmental psycholinguistics, which is all about studying how kids actually learn language and whether the data supports Chomsky's ideas.
Right. And beyond linguistics, it really helped revive nativism in other areas of cognitive science. Because if language could be innate, why not other cognitive abilities?
Exactly. And, you know, it's interesting because before Chomsky, nativism had this kind of, well, almost mystical feel to it.
Yeah, like innate ideas were these mysterious things planted in us by God or something.
Right. And, you know, on top of that, there was the simplicity argument, famously championed by Locke, the idea that all else being equal, a simpler explanation is better.
So the empiricist view, with just sensory experience and general learning, it seems simpler than the nativist view, which added all this extra stuff.
Exactly. But Chomsky, he basically addressed both of these concerns head on. He said, look, my claims about grammar and universal grammar, they're empirical hypotheses.
Like they're based on observation, on data.
Right. He grounded innateness in our biology, in our evolution. And he was always careful to distinguish between the logical possibility of something being innate and the actual evidence for it.
Okay, so he took the mysticism out of nativism, but there's still this question. Why did it take so long for nativism to make a comeback?
Right, especially considering Darwin. I mean, evolution was already well established by the time Chomsky came along.
Yeah, and evolution is all about how organisms are shaped by natural selection, how their brains are pre-wired to survive in their environment.
Exactly. We don't think a bird learns to build a nest from scratch, right?
Yeah.
It has these innate instincts.
Right, so why would humans be any different? Why would we be the only ones born as blank slates?
It's a good question. And it suggests that maybe there were some deeper biases at play, some resistance to the idea that our minds could be shaped by our evolutionary history.
Yeah, maybe it was just too radical to think that we, the pinnacle of creation, that we weren't starting from a clean slate.
Right. And, the ironic thing is that this actually weakens the empiricist's claim of simplicity.
How so?
Well, once you factor in evolution, the nativist view actually becomes simpler. Because now you're saying, look, humans are just like other animals. We've been shaped by natural selection, and that includes our brains.
It's a more unified, more parsimonious explanation.
Exactly. So, in a way, Darwin should have paved the way for nativism, but it took Chomsky to really make that connection clear.
Now, Chomsky's initial focus was on language, and for a while, a lot of the arguments for linguistic nativism relied on what seemed to be unique features of language itself.
Right. Language was seen as this special human capacity, setting us apart from other animals.
Yeah, and Chomsky himself emphasized that. He saw language as a key part of our creative potential.
Exactly. And we've already talked about the complexity of grammars. But there are other things about language acquisition that seem, well, unusual.
Okay, like what?
Well, every kid is exposed to a slightly different set of language data. right? Their primary linguistic data.
Right, like the conversations they hear, the books they read, all that.
Exactly. And you might expect that this would lead to a lot of variation in the grammars kids acquire.
Yeah, like maybe some kids would end up speaking with a slightly different grammar depending on how their parents talk.
Right. But that's not what we see. Kids generally converge on the same grammar. They make similar grammatical judgments. They make similar kinds of errors.
So it's like there's something guiding them, some kind of internal compass that's pointing them towards the right grammar.
Exactly.
Mm.
And on top of that, kids seem to be really good at filtering out bad data. Like they hear ungrammatical sentences all the time.
But they don't just incorporate those into their own grammar, they somehow know to ignore them.
Right. And then there's the speed of language acquisition. Kids pick it up so quickly, it's almost unbelievable.
Yeah, and it doesn't seem to be strongly correlated with intelligence. Like, even kids who aren't super smart can still become fluent speakers.
Exactly. And it doesn't require explicit teaching. Kids aren't sitting in classrooms learning grammatical rules.
Right. And then there's the critical period. We know that if kids aren't exposed to language early on, they'll have a much harder time learning it later.
Exactly. So all of this combined makes language acquisition look really, really special. Chomsky even distinguished between acquisition and learning, reserving the former for language.
So language was this unique thing, both in its complexity and in how it develops. But this also made it hard to see how these ideas about innateness could be applied to other cognitive abilities.
Right. I mean, is anything else as complex as language? Does anything else develop as effortlessly?
So how did nativists move beyond language?
Well, over time, the focus shifted from language being this exceptional case to a more general understanding of nativism. Chomsky himself, in 1975, he started talking about language as just one of many mental organs.
Mental organs?
Yeah, like just as we have physical organs like the heart or the lungs, we also have mental organs that develop based on our genes.
So the idea is that just like our physical organs, our mental organs are also kind of pre-programmed.
Exactly. We don't expect the kidneys to just form based on whatever's happening in the environment, right? They develop according to a genetic blueprint. So why should our mental abilities be any different?
Right. It would be weird to think that our physical nature is largely determined by our genes, but our mental nature is just a blank slate waiting to be written on by experience.
Exactly. And this analogy helps shift the burden of proof. It was no longer the nativists who had to defend this seemingly strange idea of innateness. It was the empiricist who had to explain this weird dualism.
Yeah. Why would our minds be so different from the rest of our bodies?
And this mental organs approach, it had a huge impact on cognitive science. It led to ideas like Fodor's modularity of mind hypothesis.
Modularity.
Yeah, the idea that the mind is divided into these specialized modules, each designed to handle a specific type of information.
Okay, so like a language module, a vision module, things like that.
Exactly. And these modules, they're supposed to be relatively independent. They do their own thing, and then they send their output to other parts of the mind.
Fodor thought these modules were innate.
Right. That was a key part of his theory. Now, he didn't think the whole mind was modular. He allowed for these more general central processors that integrate information from different modules.
Right, so his was a more moderate view of modularity, but others have argued for more extreme versions where basically the whole mind is made up of modules.
Exactly. And this modularity idea, it connects to another big area of research that's very nativist, evolutionary psychology.
Yeah, evolutionary psychology, the idea that our minds are basically a collection of evolved adaptations.
Right. Like they talk about the mind as a Swiss Army knife with all these different tools that evolved to solve specific problems faced by our ancestors.
So like a module for detecting cheaters, a module for finding mates, things like that.
Exactly. And they argue that these modules can explain a lot of our behavior, even behaviors that don't seem to make sense in the modern world.
So our minds are kind of stuck in the Stone Age.
In a way, yes. But, it's interesting that Chomsky himself isn't a fan of evolutionary psychology.
Yeah, he's been pretty critical of their methods.
Right. He thinks they're too quick to assume that every mental trait is an adaptation. But the broader point is that the idea of innate specialized cognitive mechanisms, it's something that a lot of people are taking seriously these days.
And this also connects to work in cognitive ethology, right?
Absolutely. Cognitive ethology is all about studying the cognitive abilities of animals.
And they're finding all sorts of complex behaviors that seem to be innate.
Yeah, like bees have this amazing navigation system based on the sun.
And birds can migrate thousands of miles without ever having been taught the route.
Exactly. And these findings, they really lend plausibility to the idea that humans might also have innate cognitive mechanisms.
So even though language was the initial inspiration for this nativist revival, it's kind of ironic that it hasn't been a perfect model for understanding other cognitive abilities.
Yeah, it's turned out that language is, well, it's really complex. And its developmental trajectory is pretty unique.
So while language has been this great example of how innateness can work, it hasn't been a perfect blueprint for other domains.
Exactly. But that's okay. The broader Nativist project isn't about finding exact copies of language in every area of cognition. It's about being open to the possibility that we might have innate predispositions that shape how we learn and understand the world.
Okay, so we've talked a lot about Chomsky and the general nativist perspective, but there were other big players in the field, right? Like Piaget.
Yeah, Piaget. He was this incredibly influential developmental psychologist. He spent decades meticulously documenting how kids' understanding of the world changes as they grow up.
Yeah, his work on object permanence, conservation, all those classic experiments.
Exactly. And his central idea was that cognitive development happens in stages.
Stages.
Yeah, like these universal invariant steps that every kid goes through, no matter their culture or background.
Okay, so like first you understand X, then you understand Y, then you understand Z, and there's no skipping stages.
Right. And he thought these stage transitions were driven by internal cognitive restructuring, like the kid's brain literally reorganizing itself.
It's almost like those paradigm shifts in science that Kuhn talked about.
Yeah, kind of. But there's some key differences. For Kuhn, a paradigm shift in physics might be completely different from a paradigm shift in biology.
But for Piaget, the mechanism of change, the way kids move from one stage to the next, it was the same across all domains.
Exactly. And Piaget's stages, they were more like mandatory milestones, whereas scientific progress can be much more unpredictable.
So where does Piaget fit into the whole nativism-empiricism debate?
Well, he wasn't really a hardcore nativist or empiricist. He definitely acknowledged the role of experience in shaping development, but he also emphasized the importance of these innate, stage-like changes.
So he's kind of in between.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say. But what's important is that his work really helped shift the focus in developmental psychology towards understanding how kids actually think.
And this led to some really interesting work inspired by Chomsky.
Right. Some developmental psychologists, they looked at Chomsky's arguments about language and they thought, maybe we should apply this to other domains.
So they started looking for evidence of innate knowledge in areas like physics or number or even social cognition.
Exactly. And they took Chomsky's mental organs analogy seriously. They started thinking of cognitive abilities as potentially having their own specialized modules.
And this led to the core cognition hypothesis, right?
Right. The core cognition hypothesis is basically the idea that we're born with a set of core knowledge systems that guide our understanding of the world.
Okay, so what are these core systems?
Well, there's some debate, but most people agree on at least three. A system for understanding physical objects, a system for representing number, and a system for understanding other minds.
Okay, so like basic physics, basic math, and basic psychology.
Yeah, exactly. And it's important to note that this is a moderate form of nativism.
Moderate?
Yeah, because it doesn't say that everything we know is innate. It just says that we have these core systems that get us started.
Right, like we're not born knowing calculus, but we are born with some basic understanding of how objects behave.
Exactly. And these core systems, they're often called intuitive theories, like folk physics, folk psychology, things like that.
So it's like we're born with these rough drafts of theories about the world.
Yeah, and then experience comes in and fills in the details, revises the theories, maybe even overturns them completely in some cases.
So how do you even study this stuff in babies? I mean, I can't exactly tell you what they're thinking.
Right, that's the tricky part. But researchers have come up with some clever methods. One of the most famous is the violation of expectancy looking time paradigm.
Violation of expectancy. Sounds complicated.
It's actually pretty simple. The idea is that if you show a baby something surprising, something that violates their expectations, they'll stare at it longer.
Makes sense. Like if I saw a ball suddenly float up in the air, I'd probably stare at it too.
Exactly. So in a typical experiment, you first habituate the baby to some event.
Habituate.
Yeah, you just show it to them over and over again until they get bored of it. And then you show them two test events. One is possible, one is impossible.
Okay, so like you show them a ball rolling behind a screen and coming out the other side, and then you show them a ball going behind a screen and disappearing.
Exactly. And if the baby stares longer at the impossible event, it suggests that they had an expectation about what should have happened.
And that expectation was violated. Okay, so let's talk about some specific examples. What about our understanding of physical objects?
Yeah, that's one of the core domains where there's been a lot of research.
Right, because for empiricists, our knowledge of objects comes from experience. We move around, we touch things, we see how they interact, and we gradually build up this understanding.
Exactly. And Piaget famously argued that babies don't even understand object permanence until quite late.
Object permanence.
Yeah, the idea that an object continues to exist even when you can't see it. Like, if I hide this pen under my hand, you still believe it's there, right?
Yeah, of course. But Piaget thought babies didn't get that until they were almost 2 years old.
Right. But then Bay Largin, she did this really cool study in the 1980s using the violation of expectancy method.
Okay, what did she do?
She showed babies a screen rotating back and forth, and then she hid an object behind the screen. And in one test event, the screen stopped where the object was. In the other event, the screen rotated right through the object, like it wasn't even there.
Wait, so the screen just went through the object, like it was a ghost?
Yeah, basically. And the babies, they stared longer at that impossible event. Yeah. Even 5-month-old babies.
So they knew the object was still there, even though they couldn't see it.
Exactly. Which means they had some understanding of object permanence much earlier than Piaget thought. Yeah. And later studies showed this in even younger babies.
Wow, that's amazing. And there's other research showing that babies have expectations about how objects move, right?
Yeah. Like, they expect objects to move continuously. They don't expect them to just teleport from one place to another.
Right. And they expect objects to be solid. Like, two objects can't occupy the same space at the same time.
Exactly. And all of this suggests that these basic intuitions about the physical world, they're not learned from scratch. They were there from very early on.
And it's not just human babies, right?
Right. There's this cool study with newborn chicks. They showed that chicks who've had very limited visual experience, they also seem to understand object permanence.
Really? How did they show that?
Well, they imprinted the chicks on an object, and then they hid the object. And the chicks, they can reliably find the hidden object, even though they'd never seen an object hidden before.
So it's like they just knew that objects don't just disappear.
Exactly. And this is a really strong argument for nativism because it shows that, at least in some species, this knowledge of objects is innate.
Okay, so what about number? Do babies have any understanding of that?
Yeah, there's some really interesting work on that. When she did these studies where she showed babies' objects being added and subtracted.
Okay, how did that work?
Well, she'd put one object behind a screen, then add another, and then either reveal two objects or just one.
And the babies could tell the difference.
Yeah, they looked longer when the wrong number of objects was revealed. Like, if they saw 1 + 1, they expected to see 2.
Wow. So does that mean babies can do math?
Well, not exactly. The number of objects they can track is very small, usually just up to 3.
Okay, so it's more like they're keeping track of individual objects rather than doing actual arithmetic?
Right. And there's debate about how this early ability relates to our full adult understanding of number.
Yeah, because adults, we can count indefinitely, right? We have this concept of a successor function.
Exactly. And some researchers think that this concept is also innate. Others think it develops later, maybe through language.
So the jury's still out on that one. But it's clear that babies have some pretty sophisticated abilities when it comes to representing number.
Absolutely. And, before we move on from number, it's worth mentioning one more thing that challenges Piaget's ideas.
What's that?
Well, Piaget thought that babies couldn't coordinate information from different senses until much later.
Like they couldn't connect what they see to what they touch.
Exactly. But then Meltzoff and Moore, they did this study where they showed that newborn babies can imitate facial movements.
Wait, so like if you stick your tongue out at a newborn, they'll stick their tongue out back?
Yeah, pretty much. And they found similar results in baby monkeys.
That's crazy. So that means babies have some kind of innate connection between vision and motor control.
Exactly. It suggests that our senses are much more integrated from the start than Piaget thought.
Okay, so let's shift gears and talk about our understanding of other minds.
Yeah, this is another really fascinating area of research. It's all about theory of mind.
Theory of mind. So like being able to understand that other people have their own thoughts, beliefs, desires, all that.
Exactly. And this area was really influenced by this question that Premack and Woodruff posed back in 1978.
What was that?
They asked whether chimpanzees have a theory of mind.
Chimps. Wow.
Yeah. And this really sparked a whole wave of research on theory of mind in humans.
Right, because if chimps might have it, then we definitely need to figure out how it develops in kids.
Exactly. And one of the most famous tests for theory of mind is the false belief task.
The false belief task.
Yeah, it's a classic test. Like, there's this story about Maxie and the chocolate. Maxie puts his chocolate in a blue cupboard, and then he goes out to play. While he's gone, his mom moves the chocolate to a green cupboard. Then Maxie comes back, and the question is, where will he look for his chocolate?
Okay, so he'll look in the blue cupboard, right? Because that's where he left it.
Yeah, but that's where the false belief comes in. He believes it's in the blue cupboard, but it's actually in the green cupboard.
Ah, I see. So the question is whether kids can understand that Maxie will act based on his false belief.
Exactly. And the typical finding is that kids younger than about 4 years old, they fail this task.
So they think Maxie will just magically know that the chocolate has been moved.
Yeah, pretty much. They haven't quite grasped the idea that other people can have beliefs that are different from reality.
Okay, but more recently, researchers have started to question whether the false belief task is the be-all and end-all of theory of mind.
Right. There's a growing recognition that maybe there are more basic forms of social understanding that develop earlier.
Like maybe babies can understand something about goals or intentions even before they can pass the false belief test.
Exactly. And there's been a lot of research on this using looking time measures.
So like seeing how long babies stare at different events that involve agents acting in goal-directed ways.
Right. And they found some really cool stuff. Like Woodward did this study where he showed babies a hand reaching for an object. And then he switched the object.
So the hand was reaching for like a ball and then suddenly it was reaching for a teddy bear?
Yeah, something like that. And the babies, they looked longer when the hand reached for the new object.
So it's like they understood that the hand had a goal and they were surprised when the goal changed?
Exactly. And other studies have shown that babies are really sensitive to the way humans reach and grasp.
Like if you just use a stick to move the object, they're not as impressed.
Right. It's like they understand that reaching and grasping are special. They're signs of an agent trying to achieve a goal.
And this extends to inanimate objects too, right?
Yeah. If you show a baby an object moving on its own, like a self-propelled toy, they'll start to attribute goals to that object.
So it's like anything that moves on its own, they think it must have a mind of its own.
In a way, yes. And they've even found that babies are sensitive to an agent's perceptual information. Like, if an agent can't see something, the baby won't expect them to act on it.
Wow, that's really sophisticated. So it seems like babies have a much richer understanding of other minds than we used to think.
Yeah, and goes beyond just understanding goals. There's also this amazing work on how babies respond to helpers and hinderers.
Helpers and hinderers.
Yeah. They show babies these little animations where one character is trying to achieve a goal and another character either helps them or hinders them.
Okay, so like one character is trying to climb a hill and another character either pushes them up or pulls them down.
Exactly. And what they find is that babies, even 3-month-old babies, they prefer the helpers.
Really? So they're already making moral judgments. Expert.